So back at the train station today, gonna head back to Toledo finally after the first visit in October. Finally making it back to go take some more photos. Now that I got a better idea of what Toledo is about, what I want to share with you guys. Yeah, some churches, some mosques, some synagogues, just to give some visual clues as to the three cultures that lived there together and did all this translation work roughly, 1,300 years ago or so. So let's get on the train. Bye. So that's Toledo behind me, World UNESCO Heritage Site, major center of translation from about 700 to 1200. In 711, the Moors came up from North Africa and pretty much dominated the entirety of Spain, or what is now Spain, except for the northern ridge up above the Cantabrian mountain range. And here in Toledo, you had these three cultures living together. You had Christians, Muslims, and Jews living together, and a lot of them worked together to do this translation work of a lot of ancient texts, mostly scientific, medical, astrological, alchemical, lots of varying texts from around the world, some that were banned by the church, but for a time you could actually, or people came here to study because they could actually get access to those texts and they could work with them and read them and translate them. And one of the main thrusts of the work that was done here was to translate the work into the most broadly understandable language, which at the time there was an attempt to make Castilian Castellano a broadly understandable and approachable language instead of maybe the dense and impenetrable languages of Greek and Latin, which I guess not many people knew. But you had a lot of translators here working on that to get texts widely available and understandable to a lot of people. A lot of people come from a long way around, long distances from around the world to live and work here. Jews, Muslims, and Christians working together. Again, we're going to go in and take some photos of those areas of town and provide a little bit of context for this alchemical translation work that was done so long ago. See you inside. So first off, if there's noise in the background, I apologize. It's because my neighbor is upstairs is building a rocket ship while wearing 14-inch stilettos. Drives me nuts. So if there's bumps and stuff like that, it drives me as nuts as it does you, I guess. Anyway, so yeah, I wanted to talk about the Toledo image. I've been having a hard time trying to figure out how to break down the story for the video, but I was just talking to a friend on the phone and explaining the image, and so that was really easy and it was fun, and I figured why not just explain the image that I made to you guys and see how it goes over, see if you like that, if that's a cool way to help you engage with the subject matter, enjoy the image that I made, understand it better, and hopefully connect you to the ideas that we find in history, and not just understand the image I made, but hopefully be given some tools to understand more of pop culture and the world around us, history and all that kind of stuff. So let's get started. So a little bit of the background about Toledo, Spain. Toledo, Spain is in Castilla-La Mancha, which is south of Madrid, and I was interested in Toledo, Spain because of its history with translation work, and specifically the fact that there was a history of translating alchemical literature. So that was my justification for going there. And really, I just wanted to use Toledo as a springboard to be able to talk about alchemy in the future and lay a foundation for that conversation to be had later. So why alchemy? So alchemy is sort of, I think we're all familiar with the idea of turning lead into gold. And it seems like when a lot of people when they hear alchemy, they think that there were these alchemists in the medieval times trying to physically turn lead into gold. And maybe there were some people that were trying to do something like that. But at the heart of alchemy was more of a philosophy of turning a base material into a precious material. And so turning lead, which is, I guess, relatively not valuable, into a valuable material like gold. So there's that, but at the heart of the practice of alchemy and at the heart of a lot of the material, the alchemical material, is this idea about self-perfection, the idea of turning your leaden emotions, your leaden physical body, your leaden mind into golden mind and perfecting it. Gold is seen as this pure, beautiful, wonderful material compared to lead. So there's a spiritual transmutation that the alchemists are trying to effect, a mental transmutation, and that works itself out in the body too. So these alchemists, they were sort of precursors to empirical scientists, I guess. But it's people like Terence McKenna, who's great to listen to, especially his talks on alchemy. He would say that, and I think Eliade says this in his books too. Those guys would say that any of the scientific findings that we still have from the alchemical experiments are just accidents. What the alchemists were good at was experimenting. They weren't necessarily good at trying to understand physics and the laws of gravity and the laws of... Their goal wasn't scientific revelations. They were more interested in the philosophy of how do I refine my mind so that I'm not stuck in a cycle of fear and desire all the time. And if that sounds familiar, that's because that idea is very similar to the yogic traditions of trying to exit the cyclical cycle of samsara, the wheel of rebirths, of being born and dying and being born and dying. Much like our emotions are born and then they die and then they come back again. We're afraid, we're not afraid, we're happy, we're sad, but then we're happy again, but then we're sad again. So in the ideas of alchemy, you have the same thing going on, basically trying to bring the mind to a perfected state. And Eliade, in his book, The Forge and the Crucible, talks about the alchemist mindset, that it was exactly that. They were trying to bring, when they were working with physical materials, they were trying to bring these physical materials to a perfected state, which they all saw as ending up in gold. Everything that's perfect is gold. And so that's why there's such a strong association with gold and alchemists. In Eliade's book, The Forge and the Crucible, he draws the alchemical lineage all the way back to the smith, the blacksmith, essentially, because in the past, when people had first discovered the ability to make iron and things like that, they associated the creation of such materials as with a magical process, so that it was a very mysterious process, the ability to bring iron into existence and then to be able to use it. And so the blacksmiths in these times and these metal workers, these metallurgists, were actually separated from society. They were considered demons or bad, or mysterious wizards and shamans and wielders of magic. And so there was a taboo around them. And around the actual practice of metallurgy, there were lots of taboos and lots of secret rituals. You had to be initiated into the craft of being a metallurgist or a blacksmith. And this is where the foundation of the alchemical practice comes from. All of the literature that we have about alchemy, it has its history built into the tradition of the metallurgist. Just think about it. The metallurgist is playing with materials, trying to refine it to a specific state, much like, so like an iron worker, a blacksmith. They're trying to mess with the material to fashion it into something that's useful to them. And that's exactly what the alchemist was trying to do. They're trying to fashion a material into something beautiful, useful, and perfected, gold, right? So that's a little bit of the history of where alchemy came from, and a little bit of an explanation of what it is and what it isn't. It isn't necessarily this scientific or pseudo-scientific practice. At its heart, it was more of a philosophy, according to people like Joseph Campbell and Mircea Eliade and Terence McKenna. Campbell, again, when you look at his literature on alchemy, he'll say the same thing, especially in his book, Creative Mythology, which is actually sitting under my camera right now, giving me a little bit of height on the video. So anyway, in that book, he talks about the human being, the alchemist, being perfected. At the beginning, there's this process of putrefaction where you're basically dissolving the different components of the human being and distilling out all of the gross material, all the dirty stuff, all the emotions, all the ideas, all the habits, all of the mental states that the alchemists would think are imperfect, much like the yogic teachers would think are imperfect. So fear and desire. And then, you've got the alembic, the retort, and all these other different tools for baking out or cooking out all the bad stuff, and then distilling all of the good golden material, the prima materia, the lapis lazuli, the philosopher's stone. So a little bit about the philosopher's stone. The philosopher's stone is what every alchemist was trying to achieve. And the philosopher's stone is this strange material that doesn't really have a shape because it can take any shape. It's just all of its characteristics are perfect. It's good for every situation. And it kind of reminds me of Bruce Lee's saying, be like water. You can fill up any glass you need to fill. You can basically adapt yourself to any situation. That might be kind of a helpful, that quote was butchered, I'm sure, but that might be kind of a helpful way to relate to alchemical ideals and try to understand what the hell these guys were talking about. So alchemy is a philosophy and not a science, or I guess it's sort of a pseudoscience, but let's not try to figure out how to build buildings and build computers off of old alchemical texts. I think that's probably a decent enough foundation to carry forward into how all this stuff relates to Toledo, Spain. So in Toledo's an interesting place. Again, it's south of Madrid in Castile-La Mancha, southwest. It's about a 30-minute train ride from Madrid, and it's had an interesting past. So a long time ago, there were Romans in Spain, and then the Christian Visigoths came in and took all of Spain over, and then the Moors came up from North Africa, from the south, and took over all of Spain except for the area north of the Cantabrian mountain range, which includes like País Vasco, Asturias, Cantabria, and Galicia. And so those areas were left, I guess they were run by Christians. And then I forgot when, sometime later, those northern kingdoms came back down and pushed the Moors out. Well, and so Toledo has changed hands a lot. For a long time, it was actually this was the I think it was the capital of Spain. It was the capital of the Islamic Caliphate that existed. I'll throw a graphic up if I'm wrong about that. I might be. But at that time, you had Jews, Muslims, and Christians living together. And and in 711, that's when the Moors took over Spain. And in Toledo, again, you had these different faiths, these different cultures, these different religions coexisting next to each other. And so you had this air of multiculturalism and multilingualism going on there. Just tons of different ideas meshing together. People were intermarrying, cultures were blending together, and all that kind of stuff. And then later, when the Christians came back and took over, I think it was in the 11th century, you had this attempt to breed a school of translators in Toledo, because you had so many people talking different languages, and you had so many people from around the world coming to Toledo because it was becoming a center of translation, and it was a great place to learn languages. And if you're a scholar, it's a great place to learn stuff, to get access to different literature that may not be available in other places. And so tons of people were, well, it's not a big place, but there were people there. There's a high concentration of people there concentrating on translation work. Some of that work included alchemical texts. It sounds like, from what I've read, the majority of the work was more about medicine, philosophy, science, I'm sure architecture, philosophy for sure. But at that time, we think alchemy, we hear alchemy now, we think, okay, that's just like this goofy, interesting, kind of occultic thing that exists. But alchemy at the time didn't enjoy or didn't have to deal with that big of a distinction from all of these validated areas of study, like literature, like language, like mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. And so the alchemical literature that was being translated was treated with respect. It was treated as though this is true, this is valuable, this is something we need to study. And there's one thing, I think it was a Jewish scholar, Moshe, let me get his name. I'm going to butcher this too, but his name was Yehuda ben Moshe, and he was a Jewish translator, and he translated this apparently important alchemical work called the Secretum Secretorum. It was supposedly a treaty written by Aristotle to Alexander the Great, and yeah, just has a bunch of hermetic ideas. Hermeticism being, I don't know, Hermeticism is something that's riddled with symbology and esoteric ideas, and sort of like maybe the Kabbalah, the Jewish Kabbalah, you have to have years of studying other literature to get access to what something like the Kabbalah means. So in Hermeticism, I think a lot of those texts are the same way. You have to spend years looking at other pieces of literature, ancient literature, to understand the symbols, so that you can then approach something like the Secretum Secretorum, which was translated by a Jewish scholar there in Toledo. And that's another thing. If you go to Toledo, you can see the history of these three different faiths there coexisting. There's churches everywhere, obviously, and there's mosques. Well, there's at least one. I went to one. There may have been more. I didn't get that far. And there's also at least one synagogue. I went to that one as well. And so, and all these buildings in Toledo, they've been repurposed over the years. So it'll be a church, then it'll be a mosque, then it'll be a synagogue, then it will go back to being a church. And when you look at the architecture, you go into a synagogue or a mosque, and you see this mishmash of an Islamic influence, and then Christian reappropriation, and then I think in the Santa Maria la Blanca, I think that's how you say it, the synagogue that I went to, Muslim architects or Arabic architects actually designed a lot of the features inside of the synagogue, and it's beautiful work. All of the work in all of those places there is beautiful. The Toledo Cathedral is insane. I've got pictures of it. I'm going to put pictures in the video. The mosque that was there, which is called the Cristo de la Luz, which translates into the Christ of the Light, which is, kind of an interesting name for a mosque. I think that's just because it's been reappropriated and reused over the years. So it was a mosque at first, and it became a small church, or vice versa. I don't know the history of it, but the architecture shows that it has an Arabic influence with the arabesque arches in the pillars. So it seems like, from what I've read and from what I've seen there, that all these different people groups were highly valued. They were, from what I've read on the Wikipedia article, the Muslim scholars were highly regarded, the Jewish scholars were highly regarded, the Christian scholars were highly regarded, and it's cool because these guys were all working on something. This is why I'm interested in alchemy, and specifically alchemy in Toledo, because these three different faiths, at some points they agree, at some points they disagree in the literature, but these scholars were working on a philosophy, the philosophy of alchemy, which sort of transcends the names of the gods of those specific religions. It's like pulling away the layers of different stories and trying to get at the heart of what that story is about. So, for instance, as Campbell would say, if you look at the crucifixion story of Jesus, there's an alchemical line going through that, which is about spiritual perfection. It's like, in a sense, it's the end of an age, the end of an era, the end of a life, and the beginning of another, more transcendent, perfected life. So, in a sense, alchemy and the ideas of alchemy and the ideas of self-perfection, turning lead into gold, lie at the base of almost any faith, maybe potentially. But here, even Campbell would say this too, and Eliade would say the same thing, at the base of these faiths is this sort of alchemical idea, which is very much a yogic idea. So alchemy is sort of a Western version of yoga. And yoga in the philosophical sense, not double dog daria, whatever it is, the pose, I don't know, greeting the sun, that kind of stuff. And so that's the foundation. That's a little bit about Toledo. That's a little bit about why I wanted to make the image, the foundation of understanding the image. So let's walk through the image. Let's start with the tongue. So if you look at the tongue, it's a severed tongue. At the bottom, there's 3 parts, and those are supposed to signify or remind us of the 3 different cultures that lived in Toledo at the same time. And they were 3 different tongues, but when they did this translation work, trying to translate from their own respective languages into another language, or to one of the efforts going on in Toledo was to formulate a Spanish language, the Castilian, or I guess what's now, Castellano, Spanish. These folks were working on that and trying to make it happen. So from all these 3 different cultures, they were essentially trying to merge into one tongue and speak with one tongue eventually at the end of it. One of King Alfonso, I can't remember which one it was, he was trying to, at the time when he was sort of head of the school of translators in Toledo, he was trying to formulate the Spanish language and create a language that was accessible and easy to understand by as many people as possible. So out of the efforts of these 3 different cultures, you're basically trying to communicate with as many people as possible, trying to get these ideas known and out there so that people are on the same page. So that's the point of the trifurcated tongue. And all the veins sticking out of it are a reference to the Vajra, which is an Indian or a Hindu yogic idea of enlightenment. It references a lightning strike, and the lightning strike is a lightning strike which represents enlightenment. So when the light bulb goes off in your head and you remember something or you figure something out, it's the same kind of idea. There's an event of revelation going on. So the veins in the tongue are supposed to sort of look like a bolt of lightning to reference that idea of enlightenment, because all the stuff these guys are working on in Toledo are sources of enlightenment and knowledge and wisdom. So that's the tongue. So now the book, let's read through it. So in the top left, there's a moon. Top right, there's Luna, which means moon. In the bottom left, there's the word Sol, which means sun. And then on the right, there's an icon of the sun with the rays coming out. In the middle, on the left, we have plomo a oro, which is Spanish for lead to gold, which obviously references the alchemical process or the alchemical ideal, turning lead into gold. On the right side, there's the words conjunctio oppositorum, which is the marriage of opposites. So that idea in alchemy is, again, sort of a yogic idea. I'm going to try to break that down a little bit. So normally we break things down into a binary, trying to think of things as either all good or all bad. Do I want this? Do I not want that? Take this, leave that. So you're left with two opposing choices. Now, in the conjunctio oppositorum, you've got the marriage of opposites. And so it's like looking at two things, and when normally you think that they're opposed to one another, it's actually seeing how they overlap, intermingle, come together, and actually interplay with one another, much like the yin and the yang symbol. So on the yin and the yang symbol, you've got the circle, and half of it is a curved teardrop that's white, and the other half is a curved teardrop that's black. And in each teardrop, you have a dot of the opposite color. So in some sense, in the black teardrop, there's a little bit of white, and in the white teardrop, there's a little bit of black. And how that relates back to alchemy is the idea that things aren't as distinct and concretely opposed to one another as they always seem to be. For example, it's really easy to use the United States as an example. For example, take a Republican and a Democrat, and in popular culture and in the media at large, they're portrayed as exact opposites. But in real life, if you go and you meet these people, well, you're going to see, well, they have moms, they have dads, they have grandparents, they have families, they want a lot of the same things that the opposite side wants, and there's all this interplay. So as we break things down into their constituent parts, we see that they're not necessarily 100% opposed to one another. There's much more interplay and intermingling and interdependency upon one another. And so the conjunctio oppositorum, let's try to apply it to that political example, let's say. That would, instead of that holding one is totally righteous and one is totally evil, pick which political party you want to put in which camp. When we hold that pair of opposites completely against each other, we get this intense feud and this intense comparison and self-righteousness and turning one or the other into a monster. But the conjunctio oppositorum, when applied to this schema here, it starts to show us, oh wait, there's more interplay, there's more overlap. So their distance from one another and their distinction from one another isn't as far away as I thought it was. So I'm not as angry anymore. I'm not freaking out as much anymore about their seeming differences and their seeming opposition to one another. It shows that the opposites are actually married together and that they have much more to do with each other and interplay off of one another than before. And part of that, part of the goal of thinking like that is to decrease the intensity of all of the anxiety that comes from holding all of existence as a pair of opposites, saying that all of these things are completely evil and have no redeeming qualities to it, or nothing that I need out of it, or saying that this is all good and there's nothing bad that can come about it, or that there's nothing destructive to me that could come out of this wholly 100% good thing. So that's the book. So the book obviously represents the alchemical literature that was being worked on in Toledo. Okay, so what about the sword? So the sword is sort of a crusty, rusty old sword, and it's in the shape of Jesus being crucified, right? So at the head of it, we've got this gross skull with a bunch of thorns coming out of it. And then in the hands, we've got these marks where nails could have gone. And then there's a banner wrapped around it that says 12 and then 10/77. So 1210, 1277 were the years that the Paris condemnations were handed down from, I think it was a school, or it was a Catholic school, university, or maybe it was from the Roman Catholic Church itself, the papacy. I can't remember. I'll put that up on the screen. And so the sword represents the efforts to cut off the translation work, because those condemnations declared some of the teachings that would have been found in stuff like alchemical texts to be heresy. So you can't talk about it. You can't deal with these texts anymore. You can't teach it. You can't read it. And so there was an effort from the church to quash those ideas. Now, why would they want to quash those ideas? I don't know. But if I was going to guess, I would say that the teachings and ideas in alchemy would run counter to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church at the time. And if you imagine that the Roman Catholic Church at the time was this massively powerful organization, I mean, they had the Inquisition, there were witch trials and all this kind of stuff in Spain and all, trying to quash heresy. But why? Well, heresy would threaten that structure. So this power structure that has been built up around specific ideals, well, when other ideals come in to rub up against it, well, that's going to be a threat to that power structure, that hierarchy, that body of people working together. The teachings in alchemy would run against some of the teachings in something like a formalized religion, because it would say, well, you don't have to go to a priest, you don't have to repeat this pattern of going to church, you don't have to give your money here, you don't have to think this way, you don't have to think that Jesus was a literal figure, you can think of it more in a symbolical way. Well, if you start saying that kind of stuff, well, that's going to take away some of the efficacy and the power of any structure you're going to be that has ideals against that. So the Paris condemnations, I think, were an attempt to quash anything, any teaching, any speaking about anything that would go against what was accepted doctrine from the church. So, and the church was a bit of a Goliath in the sense that it's huge and it's massively powerful. So the sword has the word Goliath on it to represent its aspect, the Catholic Church's aspect as a Goliath in its powerful presence. So what about at the bottom of the book? I've got Goliath written on sort of these bookmarks that are hanging off the bottom of the alchemical book. So I wanted to put Goliath down there too, because the David and Goliath story is pretty familiar. It's pretty well known. You've got this giant fighting a tiny boy. And so we could think of the Catholic Church as the giant, and I was going to originally pit the alchemists as the Davids against the Goliath, but it seems more like alchemical literature is sort of its own Goliath, in the sense that alchemy and the practice of alchemy was never formalized into a hierarchical religion like the Roman Catholic Church was, but it's still an immensely powerful idea and powerful philosophy that always sort of exists underneath the surface of history, and throughout time and various cultures these alchemical ideas are there, and they're sort of behind the scenes, whereas the Goliath of the Catholic Church, let's say, is in the front of the scene. Everybody knows about it. It's always there. It's ever present. People know all the ideas. They're familiar with the stories and sort of the structure of it. And it's available everywhere. So it's this big Goliath in that sense. But then alchemy is sort of a subtle Goliath, in the sense that it's always there behind the scenes, and these ideas are invading culture and literature and movies, music, and thought all the time, but it's just a little bit more unknown, a little bit more obscure, more occult. But it's big, it's giant, the ideas are powerful, it's always there. So that's why I put Goliath on the book, because it's not really a David in the sense that it's weak or small or tiny and then it's going to shatter the Goliath of the Roman Catholic Church. It's just more of that, it's the complementary sibling to an organization that's immense and powerful and upfront, like the Roman Catholic Church. So it's almost, I wanted to make this picture as though there were two Goliaths fighting with each other, or in some sense dancing with each other, because their ideas bounce back and forth between each other, and they're in conflict and refinement, or they're in conflict with one another, and from that conflict you get some refinement of ideas. So that's what that's about. That's why there's Goliath in the bookmarks on the book, on the alchemical book. Also, in the alchemical book, in the top left, there's a moon symbol, and then to the right, it's the word luna, which means moon. And then below that, at the bottom, there's the word soul, and then a symbol of the sun across from that. So soul means sun, and then there's a symbol of the sun. And those are in the book to remind us about the idea of the marriage of opposites. The sun and the moon are opposites of one another, but they're ever present, they're always there, and the symbolism of the sun and the moon have been used in alchemical literature and tons of other literature to signify that pair of opposites. And then in alchemy, what they wanted to do was marry that solar ideal with that lunar ideal. So you're not only basking in the light of one or the other. The alchemists were interested in, okay, how do we bring the unique qualities of the sun and the unique qualities of the moon together at the same time, so that we're not only basking in the light of one or the other at a time. So that's why those are there. The two little symbols inside of the tongue, or between the trifurcated sections of the tongue, well, on the left, that's the alchemical symbol for lead. And then on the right, that's the alchemical symbol for gold. So that's just to remind us that the work of the translators that worked with these different languages and spoke in these different tongues and tried to bring them together were essentially, with the alchemical literature, trying to turn lead into gold. Okay, so what about those hands up there? Well, those are mudras. On the left is the Varun, V-A-R-U-N, mudra, which in yogic practice is beneficial for communication, and it's clear speech. If you have speaking disorders or anything like that, it's supposed to symbolize and be a hand gesture to be performed to increase the ability to communicate or to rid yourself of speech problems, impediments, and things like that. On the right is the Shunya mudra, which is a hand gesture which symbolizes or is supposed to be beneficial for hearing. So these mudras are there to relate the idea of healthy speech and healthy hearing, which all goes together with translation work. So those ideas are just built back into, or tie back into, the idea of clear speech and clear hearing, so that ideas and knowledge is received and then given back in a clear way. So that's the hands. And if you look at the fingernails, they're pen nibs, because this character is a representation of the translators and their efforts. And so the work of their hands, which has been cut off, and the work of their tongues, which has been cut off by the Goliath of the Catholic Church, or is attempted to be cut off, it all relates to the translation work that they're doing. They're listening and writing stuff down, translating stuff. So those are the most important things in the image that I wanted to go over. Again, this is kind of an experiment to see if talking about the images and sort of explaining them, teaching them a little bit, is interesting. I hope this is a bit of a springboard for people to seek out some of this stuff on their own, start looking at Wikipedia articles and all that kind of stuff. I did want to relate this stuff to a couple of movies that I watched. One being The Holy Mountain. It's a movie from the 70s by Alejandro Jodorowsky. He's a Spanish director. I don't think he's from Spain. I think he's from Argentina or Mexico. But he made these sort of impenetrable, wacky movies back in the 70s. His most popular, I think, is The Holy Mountain. If you've ever seen a poster or a character or somebody dressed all in white, and they've got this white hat, it's really tall, and they're seated in a yogic posture, and there's these two naked ladies beside him, that's The Holy Mountain. That's Jodorowsky's Holy Mountain. That movie is just full of alchemical images and symbolism. The whole movie is about it. You've even got a literal interpretation of turning lead into gold through that, turning a human from lead into gold through the putrefaction process in the alembic and the retort and all those apparatuses, literally shown with a guy inside of the retort being putrefied and having his shit turned into gold. That's something that happens in the movie. It's kind of interesting. So, Holy Mountain. And also, another thing about that movie is that what people normally see, or the clips we normally see from that movie, are only about a third of the movie. The other 2/3 of the movie don't even take place in those scenes that we're so used to seeing as examples, or in trailers, or in cuts, or in clips of this film online and anywhere. So it's pretty fantastic. And there's so much in it, so much alchemy stuff in that movie. If you ever read a little bit about the alchemical symbolism anywhere, it basically is going to show up in that movie. It's like an encyclopedia of imagery. Another movie I wanted to talk about is Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven. And I think that came out back in 2008, 9, or 10. And it's about this knight, this French knight, who's actually a blacksmith, and he goes to join the Crusades in Jerusalem. And so it takes place in that time period. So the reason why I think that movie connects with alchemy is, there's a few. The first one is that Bailey, the main character, played by Orlando Bloom, is the knight who goes to Jerusalem, but he's actually originally a blacksmith. And at the beginning of the movie, he's in prison because, I can't remember why, but his brother is a priest, and I think his brother tricked him, had his wife tried and executed for witchcraft, and then has Orlando Bloom thrown in jail. And so he's in jail at the beginning of the movie. Now, Eliade, in his book The Forge and the Crucible, mentions that the shaman and the metallurgist or the smith are often on equal footing. They have these taboos surrounding them because of their craft and this magical power that they supposedly wield. So in the movie, you've got Orlando Bloom and his brother the priest are sort of on equal footing. And at one point, when Orlando Bloom is let out of prison and then has a choice of whether or not to go to Jerusalem is given the choice of whether or not to go to Jerusalem and fight in the Crusades, his brother pisses him off, and so Orlando Bloom throws his brother into the fire. And the stories surrounding the Smiths of the past often talk about part of the rituals that they have to perform as part of their craft is making a sacrifice to the fire. So in this movie, we kind of have that sacrifice to the fire. And so Orlando Bloom goes and joins the Crusades. And when he joins the Crusades, he gets to Jerusalem and he eventually inherits this plot of land that is sort of desolate and destitute. It's not being tended, it's not being farmed or anything like that. And he basically sets up a system where he irrigates the land and brings it to bear fruit. And that is another alchemical ideal about the refinement process and making something complete, tending the earth, making it bear fruit, bringing the natural course of existence to fruition, or speeding up by man's interference the natural course of nature, or refining nature itself. So he takes this desolate land, and by interfering with it with irrigation, he turns it into a crop bearing land. And that's one of the tenets of the metallurgist or alchemist's ideals. The other thing that seems to lend Kingdom of Heaven to having an alchemical undercurrent is the fact that when Orlando Bloom is going throughout the entire movie, he's never really hurt. He never loses a limb. He never suffers a great tragedy other than the one at the beginning of the film. He just is sort of even-keeled throughout the entire thing, while everybody else around him goes through these dramatic changes. I mean, tons of people are lost in battle. The city is destroyed. His friends are shot through the neck with arrows and all sorts of crazy warfare occurrences. But Balian, Orlando Bloom's character, is just sort of, he's fine the whole time. He's just sort of skating through. And I think that's important because he acts as the alchemical idea of a catalyst. Now, a catalyst is an ingredient where when it enters a recipe with other ingredients, it causes the other ingredients to react or to change or to shift. While the catalyst itself is causing that, it is never actually hurt or changed itself. So I think in the movie, Orlando Bloom enters into all of these different situations that are very volatile, and his presence is causing this change in everybody else around him, these violent, radical changes, but he himself is fine. So he seems to be sort of the catalyst in the situation, and again, that's just another point to add to Kingdom of Heaven having an undercurrent of alchemy in it. So if you watch it, bear those things in mind. Look for his role as the smith, his role as a tender of the land, a steward of the land and bringing it to perfection or gold or fruition, and then also his role as a catalyst, as someone who's not really dramatically damaged or hurt or changed throughout the entire film. But everybody else around him, the entire landscape, the people, they're all changed radically while he stays relatively safe. So that's about it. I think that's all I've got for the Toledo image. Again, I wanted to go to Toledo to be able to kickstart or jump into this topic of alchemy and sort of lay a foundation for talking about alchemy later, because as we get into more different imagery and more symbolism, alchemy is going to come up again. It's so tied up in Campbell's work and Jung's work. Jung has a whole huge tome dedicated to psychology and alchemy. And in fact, it's called that. It's in his collected works. I think it's number 12 or 14 in the collected works. I'd love to get into it. I've only read maybe 140 pages of it, and it's a huge tome. So anyway, maybe we'll get into that. Maybe I'll get to read it someday and talk about it. But hopefully the symbolism that we've talked about will spark some interest in alchemy, not as just as an attempt to turn lead, physical lead, into physical gold, but it can open up the idea that alchemy was more of a philosophy and not necessarily a scientific or pseudo-scientific practice. And then also paint a picture, no pun intended, of the dynamics between different pairs of opposites, like the Catholic Church and then the alchemists. You know, their teachings sort of rub up against one another. And they do this violent dance in some cases throughout history. So there's some things in the image that I didn't talk about. I want to leave those a little bit vague. I don't want to give too much away, but hopefully there's enough that was discussed that will spark some interest in finding out about some of this stuff on your own. Thanks for watching. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments and I'll see if I can answer them. Next, I'm going to be talking about Picasso's Guernica, and it's actually here in Madrid. It's at the Reina Sofia, pretty fantastic museum. Madrid has the best museums, and I'm going to talk about that specifically because Guernica has a bull in the painting, and Joseph Campbell actually broke down the Picasso's Guernica painting and related it back to mythology. And that's a really good gateway and a really good springboard for us to get into some of the bull imagery, its significance, where it shows up in history and where it shows up today. Psychological significance and all that kind of stuff too. So thanks for watching. Stay tuned. Sign up for my mailing list. That'll help us keep internet algorithms from keeping us apart. And again, any and all support is appreciated, whether that be through donations or through the Patreon page. Thanks so much for the support I've received so far. I really appreciate it. It's making this thing happen, and I look forward to making more. Okay, see you later. Bye.